They told you to work hard. They told you that diligence is virtue, obedience is maturity, and patience is wisdom. They told you that if you wake before the sun and sleep after the moon, prosperity will one day knock at your door. But they never told you who owns the door. They never told you who built the house, and they never told you who collects the rent on your exhaustion. You were instructed to believe that society is a ladder and that each rung is climbed by merit. Yet you were never shown the hands that hold the ladder in place, nor the boots that press down upon your shoulders to keep it steady. You were promised opportunity, but denied ownership. You were offered wages, but stripped of the wealth your labor creates. This is not an accident. It is not a flaw in an otherwise just system. It is the system. In every factory, in every office, tower, in every warehouse and field, the worker sells the only thing he possesses, his labor power. He trades hours of his life for a wage calculated not by the value he produces, but by the minimum required to keep him returning tomorrow. The difference between what he produces and what he is paid does not vanish into thin air. It accumulates, it concentrates, it becomes profit. And who profits? Not the hands that assemble the machine. Not the hands that assemble the machine. Not the minds that operate it, not the backs bent under its weight. Profit flows upward into the accounts of those who own but do not toil. Ownership, not labor, is crowned sovereign. The capitalist need not touch the soil to harvest its fruits. He need only hold the deed. You are told this arrangement is natural, that markets are impartial, that success reflects talent and failure reflects laziness. But look closely at this so-called neutrality. The worker begins each day with nothing but his capacity to labor. The capitalist begins with capital, factories, land, technology, inherited wealth. One must sell himself piece by piece to survive. The other grows richer by purchasing that survival at the lowest possible cost. This is not a fair exchange between equals, it is a structured dependency. It is exploitation concealed beneath the language of contract and choice. They tell you to compete with one another, to see your fellow worker not as a comrade but as a rival. They whisper that there are too many of you, that wages must remain low, that benefits must be cut, that security is a privilege. They divide you by nation, by race, by gender, by creed, so that you never unite around the single division that truly governs your lives. Class. For what is class? It is not merely income. It is not style or status. It is your relation to the means of production. Do you own the factory, or do you labor within it? Do you control the fields, or do you harvest for another? Do you command the machines, or are you commanded by them? As long as the means of production remain in private hands, the majority will live in perpetual precarity. Technological progress, which should liberate humanity from drudgery, instead intensifies exploitation. Machines increase productivity, but the gains are not shared. Workers are dismissed in the name of efficiency, while profits soar in the name of innovation. You are told this is progress. But progress for whom? When productivity rises, wages stagnate. When corporations expand, communities collapse. When markets boom, workers are told to tighten their belts. The wealth created collectively is appropriated privately. Society produces in common, yet a few claim the reward. And still they repeat. Work harder, while your rent climbs higher. Work harder while healthcare becomes a commodity. Work harder while education is chained to debt. Work harder while the very earth is stripped and poisoned for the sake of quarterly returns. The command to work harder is not a moral exhortation, it is a political strategy. It keeps you focused on individual advancement while systemic injustice deepens. It convinces you that the problem lies in your effort, not in the structure that absorbs your effort and returns only fragments. But history is not written by effort alone. It is written by struggle. Every advance in human freedom has been born not from quiet compliance, but from collective resistance. The abolition of feudal chains, the reduction of the working day, the recognition of labor rights, none were gifts from benevolent masters. They were victories wrested from reluctant hands. The ruling class understands its interests with clarity. It organizes, it legislates, it consolidates power across borders. Capital has no homeland. It travels wherever profit calls. And yet workers are told to remain divided, to see their suffering as isolated misfortune rather than shared condition. The truth is simple and revolutionary. You are not powerless. The entire edifice of wealth rests upon your labor. Without you, no wheel turns, no light shines, no network connects, no field yields. The capitalist depends upon the worker far more than the worker depends upon the capitalist. When you recognize this, fear shifts sides. Class consciousness is the moment the illusion shatters. It is the realization that exploitation is not personal failure, but systemic design. It is the understanding that emancipation cannot be achieved individually within a structure built upon inequality. One may escape temporarily, but the class remains enchained. The call, then, is not for charity, nor for minor reform that leaves ownership intact. It is for transformation, for a society in which the means of production are held in common, where labor is not a commodity, where human development, not profit, becomes the measure of wealth. Imagine a world where technology shortens the working day instead of swelling unemployment, where education cultivates critical thought rather than obedient workers, where production is organized for need, not for accumulation. This is not a utopian fantasy. It is a logical extension of collective ownership. They told you to work hard. They never told you that your hard work already sustains the world. They never told you that the wealth of nations is nothing but crystallized labor. They never told you that the chains binding you are forged from laws, contracts, and property relations that can be changed. The question is no longer whether you work hard enough. The question is whether you will continue to labor for a system that extracts your life and calls it opportunity. Rise not as isolated individuals, chasing scarce rewards, but as a class conscious of its strength. Organize across divisions manufactured to weaken you. Demand not crumbs, but control. Reclaim not only reforms, but the future itself. For when those who produce everything decide to own everything, the old world trembles. And from its ruins a new society can emerge, built not on exploitation, but on solidarity, not on profit, but on humanity, not on the command to work harder, but on the promise to live freer. Hard work under capitalism is praised as the highest virtue, yet its rewards rarely return to the hands that exert it. From childhood, individuals are taught that effort guarantees advancement, that discipline yields security, and that sacrifice will eventually be repaid with comfort. But beneath this moral narrative lies a harsher economic truth. The structure of capitalism is not designed to proportionally reward labor. It is designed to extract value from labor and concentrate it in the hands of those who own capital. In a capitalist system, the worker does not own the tools, the land, the machinery, the technology, or the infrastructure required to produce goods and services. These are owned by a distinct class whose wealth grants them control over production itself. The worker, possessing no property that generates income, must sell labor power in exchange for wages. This transaction appears equal on the surface, work for pay, but it conceals a fundamental imbalance. The wage represents only a fraction of the value the worker produces. The remainder, the surplus, is claimed by the owner as profit. This is the central mechanism through which hard work enriches owners rather than workers. A factory employee may produce commodities worth thousands in a single week, yet receive only enough wages to cover basic living expenses. The difference does not vanish, it accumulates as capital. The more productive the worker becomes, the greater the surplus extracted. Efficiency, innovation, and speed, while increasing total output, do not proportionally increase wages. Instead, they expand profit margins, elevate shareholder returns, and inflate executive compensation. Productivity statistics often demonstrate this imbalance clearly. As technological advancements enhance output, workers are capable of producing more in fewer hours. However, wages frequently stagnate while corporate profits rise. The narrative of meritocracy persists, but the structural reality contradicts it. The system rewards ownership, not effort. A shareholder may earn substantial income without setting foot in a workplace, while a laborer may work double shifts and remain financially insecure. Competition intensifies this dynamic. Workers are pitted against one another in a race for employment, promotions, and survival. The fear of unemployment suppresses wage demands, enabling employers to maintain lower compensation levels. Meanwhile, automation and global supply chains further strengthen capital's bargaining power. Production can be relocated, tasks mechanized, and jobs outsourced, all in pursuit of maximizing returns. Hard work becomes a requirement for mere survival rather than a pathway to prosperity. Capitalism frames this arrangement as voluntary exchange. Yet the worker's choice is constrained by necessity. Without wages, there is no access to food, shelter, healthcare, or education. The capitalist position, by contrast, is secured by accumulated wealth and property rights. This asymmetry ensures that negotiations occur on unequal terms. The worker must accept conditions offered, while the owner retains the authority to dictate them. Even entrepreneurship, often presented as an escape from exploitation, frequently reproduces the same dynamics. Small business owners, pressured by competition and market forces, must also extract surplus from employees to remain viable. The logic of profit maximization permeates every level of the system. It compels businesses to reduce labor costs, extend working hours, and intensify workloads. Hard work becomes a tool for capital accumulation rather than collective well-being. The ideology surrounding work reinforces this extraction. Cultural messages glorify hustle, resilience, and individual responsibility. Poverty is framed as personal failure rather than systemic inequality. Workers internalize blame for conditions shaped by structural forces. When wages stagnate or living see costs rise, individuals are encouraged to acquire additional skills, take second jobs, or simply work longer hours. Rarely are they invited to question why increased productivity does not translate into shared prosperity. Meanwhile, wealth concentration accelerates. Corporate executives and investors accumulate fortunes that far exceed any conceivable measure of personal labor. Financial markets enable capital to grow independently of direct production, amplifying disparities. Returns on investments often outpace wage growth, ensuring that those who already possess wealth expand their holdings faster than workers can accumulate savings. The cycle reinforces itself, widening the gap between labor and capital. Hard work under capitalism thus functions as a paradox. It is indispensable to production, yet systematically undervalued. It sustains economies, yet leaves many workers struggling. The structure channels the fruits of collective effort upward, transforming human labor into private gain. The promise that effort alone guarantees success obscures the underlying distribution of power and ownership that determines who truly benefits from that effort. The worker's dedication fuels the engine of profit, but the steering wheel remains firmly in the grasp of those who own the machine. Profit is often described as the reward for innovation, risk, and managerial brilliance. Yet beneath this polished narrative lies a more fundamental reality. Profit originates in labor that is performed but not paid for. In a capitalist system, workers sell their labor power for a wage that represents only a portion of the value they create. The difference between the value produced and the wage received forms the surplus, and this surplus becomes profit. It is not conjured from thin air, nor generated by machinery alone, nor derived from clever accounting. It is rooted in human effort there. T exceeds the compensation granted for it. When a worker enters a factory, an office, a warehouse, or a field, they exchange hours of their life for wages. The employer calculates those wages not according to the total value the worker will produce, but according to what is necessary to sustain the worker's existence and ensure their return the next day. The wage covers food, shelter, transportation, and other essentials within socially accepted standards. Yet during the working day, the employee produces commodities or services whose market value surpasses that wage. The additional value created beyond the cost of maintaining the worker is appropriated by the owner of the means of production. This appropriation is the foundation of profit. If a worker is paid for 8 hours but produces the equivalent of their wage in 4, the remaining 4 hours constitute unpaid labor. These hours are not voluntary charity. They are embedded in the structure of employment. The worker cannot simply stop after producing value equal to their wage, because the terms of employment bind them to the full working day. The capitalist purchases labor power for a set period and extracts as much value from it as possible within that time. Machinery and technology may amplify productivity, but they do not create new value independently. Machines transfer their existing value to the commodities they help produce, depreciating over time. Only living labor adds new value. When automation increases efficiency, it enables workers to generate more output in less time. However, unless wages rise proportionally, the share of surplus expands. Productivity gains thus frequently translate into higher profits rather than improved livelihoods for workers. This dynamic reveals the central contradiction of capitalism. Workers are essential to production, yet the fruits of their labor are systematically diverted. The legal framework reinforces this diversion. Property laws grant owners exclusive rights to the products generated within their enterprises. Contracts formalize wage agreements, presenting the exchange as fair and consensual. Yet the worker's consent is shaped by necessity. Survival requires employment. The capitalist's power rests on ownership, enabling them to claim the surplus as their legitimate reward. Competition among capitalists intensifies the drive to extract surplus. To remain profitable, businesses seek to reduce costs and increase output. Wages become a primary target for reduction, whether through suppressing raises, outsourcing jobs, or replacing employees with temporary contracts. Working hours may extend, workloads may intensify, and benefits may shrink. Each measure increases the portion of unpaid labor embedded in the workday. Profit margins depend on this expansion of surplus value. Financial systems further obscure the origin of profit. Dividends, interest, and stock appreciation appear detached from the labor process. Investors receive returns without direct involvement in production, reinforcing the illusion that capital itself generates wealth autonomously. Yet behind every financial gain lies a chain of labor activities: manufacturing, transporting, coding, cleaning, serving, through which surplus value is created. Finance redistributes and amplifies profit, but its source remains rooted in unpaid labor. The ideology of meritocracy masks this extraction. Workers are told that wages reflect productivity and skill, while profits reflect entrepreneurship and vision. In reality, wages are constrained by labor markets and power relations, not by the full measure of value created. A worker may double output through intensified effort, yet see minimal change in compensation. The surplus grows, shareholders celebrate, and executives receive the bonuses. The additional value flows upward. Economic crises expose the fragility of this arrangement. When markets contract, workers face layoffs and wage cuts while corporations seek bailouts and subsidies. The risks of the system are socialized, while the profits remain privatized. Even in downturns, the logic of surplus extraction persists. Labor bears the cost of adjustment, confirming that profit depends not merely on enterprise, but on a structured imbalance between those who work and those who own. Understanding profit as unpaid labor challenges the moral justification of inequality. It reveals that wealth accumulation is not simply the result of superior effort or ingenuity, but of institutionalized appropriation. The working class collectively generates the wealth of society, yet a significant portion of that wealth is siphoned away through the mechanisms of ownership and contract. Recognizing this dynamic transforms profit from a symbol of success into evidence of extraction, illuminating the concealed labor embedded within every accumulation of capital. Class division, not individual failure, creates inequality. Society persistently tells individuals that their position in life is the outcome of personal choices, discipline, intelligence, or ambition. Success is portrayed as the reward for hard work. Poverty is framed as the consequence of laziness or poor decision-making. This narrative is repeated so often that it becomes common sense. Yet it obscures a more powerful and uncomfortable truth. Inequality is not primarily the result of individual shortcomings, but of structural divisions rooted in ownership, power, and access to resources. In a capitalist system, society is fundamentally divided between those who own the means of production and those who must sell their labor to survive. This division shapes life chances long before personal effort enter. The equation: a child born into a wealthy household inherits not only material comfort, but access to superior education, networks of influence, cultural capital, and financial security. A child born into a working-class family inherits economic vulnerability, limited institutional support, and the constant pressure of survival. These starting points are not chosen. They are assigned by class position. The idea that everyone competes on equal footing ignores this structural imbalance. Education systems, often praised as engines of mobility, frequently reproduce inequality. Schools in affluent areas receive better funding, offer enriched programs, and connect students to prestigious universities. Meanwhile, underfunded institutions struggle with overcrowded classrooms and limited opportunities. The outcome is predictable. Those already privileged are better positioned to succeed, reinforcing the belief that their success is purely merit-based. Provided success is purely merit-based, employment markets operate similarly. High-paying jobs are frequently secured through connections and unpaid internships that only the financially stable can afford. Workers from disadvantaged backgrounds may possess talent and determination, yet lack the social networks that open doors. When they remain in low-wage positions, the blame is directed inward rather than toward the structures that restrict mobility. Wages themselves reflect class power more than individual value. Essential workers who sustain daily life, caregivers, agricultural laborers, sanitation workers, often receive minimal compensation despite the social importance of their roles. Meanwhile, executives and investors accumulate wealth far beyond any proportionate measure of personal effort. The disparity cannot be explained by differences in diligence alone. It arises from ownership and control. Those who own capital command income streams detached from dire CT labor, while those without property rely solely on wages. Debt further entrenches class inequality. Working class individuals frequently depend on loans for education, housing, and medical expenses. Interest payments divert income upward, limiting the capacity to accumulate savings or invest in opportunities. Wealthier individuals, by contrast, leverage assets to generate additional wealth. The system thus magnifies initial disparities over time, transforming inherited advantage into expanding dominance. Cultural narratives reinforce the illusion of individual responsibility. Media highlights stories of exceptional upward mobility while ignoring the statistical rarity of such cases. The focus on isolated success stories serves to legitimize the system, suggesting that anyone can rise if they try hard enough. Structural barriers fade from view, replaced by tales of personal grit. Those who struggle internalize failure, experiencing shame rather than recognizing systemic constraint. Class division also shapes political influence. Wealth translates into power through campaign financing, lobbying, and control over media platforms. Policies that affect taxation, labor rights, healthcare, and education are often shaped by those with economic leverage. As a result, legislation frequently protects capital accumulation rather than addressing inequality. The working class may constitute the majority, yet its political voice is diluted by concentrated wealth. Even economic crises reveal the class character of inequality. During recessions, layoffs and wage cuts disproportionately impact workers, while corporations may receive public bailouts. Losses are socialized, gains remain private. This pattern underscores that inequality is embedded in institutional arrangements, not merely in personal conduct. Technological change, often heralded as neutral progress, interacts with H-class structures in predictable ways. Automation and digitalization increase productivity, but the benefits accrue largely to owners and investors. Workers displaced by innovation are told to reskill, as though systemic transformation were a matter of individual adaptation. The responsibility for structural change is shifted onto those least equipped to absorb it. Recognizing class division as the engine of inequality reframes social analysis. It shifts attention from moral judgment to material conditions. It reveals that personal effort operates within boundaries defined by ownership, power, and inherited advantage. Power and inherited advantage. Inequality persists not because millions simultaneously fail, but because the system channels resources upward by design. The concentration of wealth, opportunity, and influence flows logically from class structures that prioritize capital over labor, embedding disparity into the very foundation of economic life. Unity among workers is the foundation of real power. Individually, the worker stands isolated before vast institutions, corporations with legal teams, financial reserves, and political influence. Alone, a single employee can be dismissed, replaced, or silenced, with little disruption to the machinery of profit. The fear of unemployment, the burden of bills, and the pressure of survival weigh heavily on the individual conscience. In this isolation, power appears distant and unreachable. Yet this perception dissolves the moment workers recognize their collective strength. Every industry, every service, every productive enterprise relies upon coordinated human effort. Machines do not operate themselves. Supply chains do not organize autonomously. Offices do not function without the labor that animates them. When workers act in unison, the continuous flow of production halts. This simple fact reveals the true source of economic power. It does not originate in boardrooms or stock exchanges. It resides in the collective capacity to produce. Division is therefore essential to maintaining control. Employers cultivate competition among employees, encouraging rivalry for promotions, wages, and recognition. Differences of nationality, ethnicity, gender, and belief are exploited to fracture solidarity. Workers are led to see one another as threats rather than allies. Suspicion replaces trust, and collective action becomes difficult. In such a fragmented environment, demands for fair wages or humane conditions appear risky and impractical. Unity transforms this dynamic. When workers organize, they replace fear with shared purpose. A single complaint can be ignored. A coordinated demand cannot. Collective bargaining shifts negotiations from unequal individual contracts to structured dialogue between organized labor and capital. The employer's advantage diminishes when faced with unified resistance. What was once a personal grievance becomes a collective issue legitimized by shared experience. Historical struggles illustrate this principle. Reductions in working hours, the establishment of safety standards, and the recognition of labor rights were not granted voluntarily by those in power. They were achieved through strikes, demonstrations, and organized movements that compelled change. Each gain emerged from solidarity, from the willingness of workers to act not merely for themselves, but for one another. The power of unity lay not only in economic disruption, but in moral force. The assertion that human dignity outweighs profit margins, solidarity also reshapes consciousness. In isolation, exploitation can feel like personal misfortune. Within a collective, patterns become visible. Workers begin to recognize that low wages, excessive hours, and unsafe conditions are not individual anomalies but systemic features. Red dialogue cultivates awareness, and awareness fosters resolve. Unity thus operates both materially and intellectually, strengthening bargaining power while clarifying purpose. Modern economies, with their global supply chains and digital platforms, might appear to weaken solidarity by dispersing labor across regions and sectors. Yet these same networks reveal interdependence. A product assembled in one country relies on materials extracted in another and logistics managed in a third. Service industries depend on coordinated efforts across departments and time zones. This interconnectedness means that collective action in one area can reverberate widely. Unity need not be confined to a single factory floor. It can extend across borders and industries. Critics often portray worker unity as disruptive or destabilizing. Yet disruption is precisely what exposes the imbalance of power. Stability under unjust conditions preserves inequality. When workers withdraw their labor collectively, they illuminate the system's dependence upon them. The temporary pause in production reveals a permanent truth. Without labor, capital is inert. Unity requires trust, communication, and organization. It demands patience and courage, particularly in environments where retaliation is possible. But the alternative, continued fragmentation, ensures perpetual vulnerability. Employers negotiate from strength when workers stand alone. They negotiate from caution when workers stand together. Collective agreements secure wages, benefits, and protections that individuals could never achieve independently. Real power does not arise from isolated acts of endurance or silent perseverance. It emerges when workers recognize their shared position within the structure of production and act accordingly. Through unity, they transform numerical majority into strategic leverage. They convert dependence into influence. They reshape the terms of negotiation and redefine the boundaries of possibility. In solidarity, labor ceases to be a scattered collection of individuals and becomes a conscious force capable of challenging concentrated wealth and asserting its rightful claim to dignity and justice. True liberation requires collective ownership of production. Political rights without economic power remain fragile, easily undermined by those who control wealth and resources. A society may proclaim freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and equality before the law, yet if the majority must sell their labor to a minority who own the factories, land, technology, and infrastructure, then freedom exists within narrow boundaries. Economic dependence shapes the limits of choice. When survival depends on wages determined by others, autonomy becomes conditional. Under capitalism, the means of production are privately owned. This ownership grants a small class the authority to decide what is produced, how it is produced, and for whom it is produced. These decisions are guided primarily by profitability rather than by social need. Essential goods may remain scarce if they yield low returns, while luxury commodities flourish because they promise higher profits. The priorities of society become aligned with capital accumulation rather than collective well-being. Collective ownership challenges this arrangement at its root. It proposes that the resources and institutions necessary for large-scale production should belong not to individuals seeking private gain, but to the community as a whole. Factories, energy systems, transportation networks, and digital infrastructures would operate according to democratically determined goals. The purpose of production would shift from maximizing profit to fulfilling human needs and advancing shared prosperity. Liberation in this sense is not merely the absence of chains. It is the presence of control over the conditions of life. When workers collectively own and manage production, they no longer confront their labor as an external force imposed upon them. They participate in shaping schedules, safety standards, technological adoption, and distribution priorities. Work ceases to be an alienating activity performed solely for wages and becomes a cooperative contribution to social life. Private ownership concentrates decision-making power. Corporate boards and major shareholders determine strategies that affect thousands or millions of lives, yet these decision-makers are accountable primarily to investors. Workers and communities bear the consequences of plant closures, outsourcing, environmental degradation, and wage suppression without possessing meaningful authority to prevent them. Collective ownership redistributes this authority, aligning power with those directly involved in and affected by production. Economic crises further reveal the limitations of private control. When profitability declines, layoffs and austerity measures follow, regardless of social cost. The livelihoods of workers become variables in calculations designed to preserve returns on investment. Under collective ownership, the criteria for decision-making would differ. Instead of protecting dividends, communities could prioritize employment stability, environmental sustainability, and equitable distribution. The focus would shift from preserving capital to sustaining human dignity. Critics argue that collective ownership suppresses innovation and efficiency. Yet innovation thrives when knowledge is shared and when workers have a stake in outcomes. Technological advancements under private ownership often aim to reduce labor costs and increase profit margins. Under collective systems, innovation could target reducing working hours, improving safety, and enhancing quality of life. Efficiency would be measured not solely in output per hour, but in the well-being generated by production. Collective ownership does not imply uniformity or the erasure of individuality. Rather, it establishes a framework in which individual development is supported by shared resources. Education, healthcare, housing, and cultural institutions could be integrated into a broader system of democratic planning. Economic security would enable people to pursue creative and intellectual endeavors without the constant anxiety of unemployment or poverty. The transition toward collective ownership requires more than legal adjustments. It demands a transformation of social consciousness. Workers must recognize their shared interests and their collective capacity to govern production. Cooperation must replace competition as the guiding principle of economic life. Structures of accountability and participation must be developed to ensure that collective institutions remain responsive and transparent. True liberation extends beyond the workplace. When production serves communal goals, social inequalities rooted in wealth disparities diminish. Access to essential goods becomes a right rather than a commodity. The divide between those who command and those who obey narrows as economic power is democratized. Collective ownership addresses the structural foundation of inequality, redefining freedom as participation in shaping the material conditions of society and embedding economic democracy at the core of human emancipation. They told you to work hard, and you did. They told you to compete, to endure, to blame yourself when the promises failed, and you carried the weight in silence. But now you see the pattern woven through every factory floor, every office tower, every field and warehouse. Your labor builds the world, yet ownership claims the reward. Profit is drawn from your unpaid hours. Inequality is carved not from personal weakness, but from class division. Isolation weakens you, while unity reveals your strength. And freedom without control over production is only a shadow of liberation. The truth is no longer hidden. The truth is no longer hidden. The wealth of society is the crystallized result of collective labor. The power that governs your lives rests upon your continued compliance. When you withdraw that compliance, when you organize, when you stand together, when you demand not charity but control, the balance shifts. Real power does not sit in distant boardrooms. It resides in the hands that produce, the minds that design, the bodies that sustain every industry. This is the turning point. To reject the myth that effort alone will save you within a system built to extract from you. To recognize that dignity cannot coexist with exploitation. To understand that liberation requires more than reform. It requires transformation. Collective ownership, democratic control, and unwavering solidarity are not distant dreams. They are the logical answers to a structure that thrives on division and unpaid labor. Rise not as scattered individuals chasing survival, but as a conscious class determined to reclaim what it creates. Organize beyond fear. Unite beyond difference. Claim the right not only to work, but to decide. For when those who produce everything choose to own and govern it together, the foundations of exploitation crack, and a new society built on equality, cooperation, and shared prosperity begins to take form in the hands of the many rather than the privilege of the few.